The gavel struck once, echoing like a gunshot through marble walls. Cameras flashed, a flurry of light and breathless whispers. All eyes turned toward the bench. Brett Kavanaugh, jaw set, eyes glinting with a strange calm. Before anyone could guess his intent, he leaned forward slightly, voice low but carrying through the chamber. "Representative Crockett," he said, "you remind me why integrity still matters." For a moment, no one breathed. The air felt heavier than stone. Some heard sincerity, others heard strategy. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her lips curved, just barely, a quiet smile that said more than any outburst could. Reporters traded glances. Was this reconciliation or condescension disguised as grace? Kavanaugh reclined, expression unreadable, as if daring her to respond, but she didn't take the bait. Her silence spoke louder than applause. The room trembled under that quiet tension, a kind that only truth, half-spoken, can create. And as the cameras kept rolling, the question lingered in every mind. Was this the moment a justice found humility, or the moment he tried to reclaim control? What no one realized then was that this single sentence, delivered like a compliment, would ignite a confrontation America would not forget. Long before that tense exchange, their stories had already collided on opposite ends of America's moral spectrum. Brett Kavanaugh, groomed in ivy-covered halls, polished by privilege and shielded by power, had become a symbol of what the system protects. His rise was written in certainty, his name etched into the architecture of institutions that rarely question their own reflection. Jasmine Crockett came from a different America, the one built by hands that never stopped moving, by families who had to shout just to be heard. She wasn't born into the game, she fought her way onto the board. Every debate, every headline, every speech carried the weight of those still waiting for justice to call their names. When their paths crossed in hearings and committees, sparks weren't just political, they were cultural, generational, and moral. He embodied a legacy that said, "This is how power looks." She stood as living proof that power could look different. Now, inside that marble courtroom, the divide wasn't just between two figures, it was a reflection of America's argument with itself. Who defines integrity? Who decides what a role model looks like? Every gaze in that room carried judgment. Every silence demanded a side. And just when the air seemed to steady, one thought pulsed through the crowd like electricity. This wasn't about respect anymore. It was about survival, image, and truth colliding in real time. No one could have known that what began as a polite remark would soon unravel into a test of the nation's conscience, and only one of them would walk away with their truth intact. Brett Kavanaugh's story began long before the cameras turned toward him that day. To his admirers, he was the golden product of a system that rewards loyalty over introspection. Yale-educated, well-spoken, a man who seemed born with authority stitched into his posture. To others, he was a living monument to everything that system refuses to question. His name first echoed through America not with reverence, but with controversy. The confirmation hearings, a spectacle of tears, fury, and defiance, left an indelible mark on the nation's memory. He pounded the desk, swore on his name, demanded belief. Those who watched saw not calm conviction, but the unmistakable pulse of entitlement, the rage of a man who believed the world owed him understanding. In interviews that followed, Kavanaugh spoke often of forgiveness, of redemption, of faith in the process. But behind those words lingered the irony of his own history. A man invoking integrity while never once stepping outside the shield of power that had carried him through every storm. To him, the narrative was simple. He had been tested and he had prevailed. The system worked. Yet to millions watching, his triumph felt hollow, not vindication but validation of how privilege survived scandal. He believed he represented stability, when in truth he embodied the tremor beneath it. Each time he spoke of decorum, the public remembered his fury. Each time he preached restraint, they recalled the tears, the shouting, the partisan fury that crowned his ascent. The contradictions weren't subtle. They were the foundation of his legacy. And that's what made his words to Jasmine Crockett so jarring. For once his armor slipped. Perhaps he thought the compliment would redeem his image or reassert control. But as his own past whispered through that marbled chamber, one truth began to unfold. When arrogance mistakes itself for grace, it's only a matter of time before the echo becomes a reckoning. Brett Kavanaugh's climb to power was built brick by careful brick. Prep school polish, Ivy League degrees, clerkships beside legends. Every step along that marble path was cushioned by expectation. By the time the country learned his name, it already carried the weight of inevitability. But the hearings changed everything. They were supposed to be his coronation. Instead, they became a mirror. The anger, the trembling voice, the reddened face, those weren't the marks of composure. They were the cracks in a portrait long painted as perfect. America watched a man who preached discipline lose it on live television, demanding sympathy instead of accountability. His defenders called it passion. His critics called it privilege unmasked. Afterward, Kavanaugh retreated behind the careful language of redemption. He spoke of lessons learned, of faith, of restraint. Yet every polished phrase carried the ghost of that defiant glare. He could never quite separate himself from the storm that birthed him. In public, he embodied order. In memory, chaos. And still he saw himself as the hero of that story, a survivor of unfair scrutiny, proof that resolve beats rumor. The irony was almost tragic. A man convinced of his integrity, blind to how many saw him as its counterfeit. So when he looked across the courtroom and praised Jasmine Crockett, the compliment carried history's weight. It wasn't just an acknowledgement, it was an attempt at absolution. He believed he was bridging a divide, reclaiming dignity. But those who knew the past heard something else, the echo of a system speaking to itself, reminding the world who still believed they defined virtue. And deep within that echo, the tremor of reckoning was already beginning to rise. Before she ever stood beneath the white lights of Washington, Jasmine Crockett learned to stand her ground in the blazing Texas heat. The daughter of working-class grit, she grew up watching her parents stretch paychecks and patience in equal measure. Her lessons weren't taught in lecture halls. They were learned at kitchen tables, in quiet prayers, and in every no she turned into a not yet. When other children dreamed of fame, she dreamed of fairness. Law school wasn't destiny, it was defiance. Every late night in the library was a promise to the people she came from, those who couldn't afford an advocate but deserved one anyway. By the time she walked into her first courtroom, she already knew that justice didn't wear a robe, it wore resilience. As a young attorney, she took on cases that polite society avoided: wage theft, police overreach, communities left out of the conversation. Reporters called her fiery, as if passion were a flaw. She smiled through it, understanding that for women like her, calm was power's camouflage. Her rise through Texas politics wasn't scripted, it was fought for, precincts by precinct, debate by debate. In one viral clip, a colleague tried to talk over her mid-sentence. She paused, tilted her head, and replied softly, "I'll finish when you stop interrupting progress." The room erupted. She didn't plank. Grace for her was the loudest form of defiance. By the time she reached the national stage, Jasmine Crockett carried more than a platform. She carried a lineage. Every woman told to lower her voice. Every community told to wait its turn. Every dream deferred but never denied. So when she entered that courtroom facing Brett Kavanaugh, her silence wasn't submission. It was centuries of strength distilled into composure. Her presence alone challenged the hierarchy that once decided who was worthy of being heard. Because for Jasmine Crockett, dignity was never about politeness. It was about power redefined. And in that stillness before she spoke, the air itself seemed to know. History had finally met its match. The silence that followed his remarks stretched thin, vibrating like a wire ready to snap. Kavanaugh adjusted his glasses, the faintest smirk crossing his face. "You carry yourself well, Representative," he said evenly. "It's refreshing to see passion contained within professionalism." Contained. The word landed like a subtle blade. Crockett's expression didn't change. "Professionalism isn't something I switch on for approval, Justice. It's what I owe the people I represent." A soft murmur rippled through the room. Kavanaugh's jaw tensed. "Of course," he said, voice smooth, "though I imagine it's challenging to balance emotion with duty." She tilted her head slightly, that half-smile returning. "Only for those who confuse emotion with weakness." The air grew heavier. Cameras zoomed in, lenses feeding the moment to millions. A senator coughed just to break the tension. Kavanaugh tapped his pen once, twice, then stopped. He leaned forward. "You're very articulate, Representative. It's admirable." "Admirable," she echoed quietly, her tone steady as stone. "Is that the word you use when you didn't expect someone like me to sound like this?" Gasps, quick and quiet. Kavanaugh blinked but didn't look away. "Someone like you?" She nodded, still calm. "Someone not born into your definition of composure." A pause. Two worlds hanging on the edge of civility. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned closer. "But I'm learning, Justice. Your version of calm requires power first. Mine was built without it." The room froze. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, afraid to move and break the spell. For the first time, Kavanaugh didn't respond. His silence wasn't confidence, it was retreat. And as the murmurs began to rise again, one thought pulsed through every watching heart. The tide had shifted, but no one was ready for how far Jasmine Crockett was about to take it next. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of camera shutters filled the silence, a metallic rhythm beating against the tension. Jasmine Crockett stood still, hands folded, eyes steady on the man who sat above her. Brett Kavanaugh's faint smile held, but it was starting to look more like a mask than control. Then, with a calmness that cut sharper than outrage, she spoke. "You know, Justice," she began softly, "I've been called a lot of things in this room, passionate, emotional, even angry. But I can't recall being called a role model by someone who once defined my tone as unbecoming." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Kavanaugh shifted in his chair. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried with the weight of every person who had ever been told to stay in their place. "But if being a role model," she continued, pausing long enough for the silence to lean forward, "means speaking truth when it's inconvenient, then I accept that with pride." There it was, the line that broke the dam. The crowd behind her straightened. Someone in the gallery whispered, "That's it." Even the marble seemed to hum with approval. Kavanaugh blinked, eyes narrowing just slightly. "No one here is questioning your truth, Representative," he said evenly. "You know, Justice," she began softly, "I've been called a lot of things in this room, passionate, emotional, even angry. but I can't recall being called a role model by someone who once defined my tone as unbecoming. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Then, with a calmness that cut sharper than outrage, she said, "You know, Justice, I've been called a lot of things in this room. Passionate, emotional, even angry. But I can't recall being called a role model by someone who once defined my tone as unbecoming." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Kavanaugh shifted in his chair. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried with the weight of every person who had ever been told to stay in their place. But if being a role model, she continued, pausing long enough for the silence to lean forward, means speaking truth when it's inconvenient, then I accept that with pride. There it was, the line that broke the dam. The crowd behind her straightened. Someone in the gallery whispered, "That's it." Even the marble seemed to hum with approval. Kavanaugh blinked, eyes narrowing just slightly. "No one here is questioning your truth, Representative. Aren't you? Every time integrity gets redefined to fit convenience, truth gets smaller. You and I just happen to stand on opposite ends of that shrinking space." The tension tightened again. A judge 2 seats down shifted, uncomfortable. The reporter sensed the storm and leaned closer. Kavanaugh inhaled, slow and deliberate. "I simply meant that your poise is admirable." She nodded once, unshaken. "And I mean that admiration without understanding can look a lot like dismissal. I've learned that when powerful men praise women like me, it's often a way to remind us how rare we're supposed to be." Murmurs again. A few heads turned toward Kavanaugh. His smile froze, lips thin, eyes hollow with restraint. Crockett went on, her voice now resonant and rhythmic, each word landing like a gavel. "But here's the truth, Justice. America doesn't need more perfect men. It needs honest leaders who remember who they serve." The audience stirred. A flashbulb popped. "It needs men," she added, eyes locked on him, "who understand that humility isn't weakness, it's accountability. And that power, no matter how divine it feels, is still borrowed." Kavanaugh looked down, as if the notes in front of him might offer shelter. They didn't. Crockett's tone softened. "I know what it's like to fight for credibility, to have my words weighed for tone instead of truth. But I also know what it means to carry communities that can't afford to lose hope. So if integrity still matters, as you said, then let's prove it by remembering who justice was meant to protect." There was no anger in her delivery, only quiet conviction. That calm was her rebellion. The room, thick with heat and disbelief, seemed to exhale as she finished. A long, trembling pause followed, part respect, part realization. And then, in a small voice from the back, someone whispered, "Say it again." Crockett's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Kavanaugh. "No," she said gently, almost smiling. "Once was enough." The flashbulbs burst like lightning. Kavanaugh adjusted his robe, pretending composure, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. The power dynamic had flipped, and everyone could feel it. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She redefined the battlefield. The commentators would later call it the moment dignity went viral. Others would frame it as the day composure conquered ego. But inside that courtroom, no one needed a headline to know what they had witnessed. Crockett gathered her papers, calm as sunrise, and took a single step back from the podium. The silence she left behind was heavier than any verdict. Kavanaugh looked up, searching for a reply that wouldn't come. The echo of her words, truth, humility, service, hung in the air like a verdict of its own. And as she turned to leave, the nation leaned forward, breath held, waiting for the aftershock that was already rippling beyond those marble walls. By the next morning, the clip had spread like wildfire. 10 seconds of composure, one sentence delivered with grace, had become the heartbeat of a nation hungry for dignity. On every platform, the same hashtag surged to the top. Hashtag Crockett class, hashtag echo of dignity, hashtag grace under fire. Reaction videos flooded the internet. Teachers replayed the moment in classrooms, their voices trembling with pride. One woman wrote, "My daughter just asked me if she can be like her when she grows up." A civil rights activist posted, "That's what strength looks like when you've carried generations on your back." The comments section read like a chorus of gratitude. Cable panels erupted by sunrise. Progressive commentators called it a masterclass in controlled fire. Late-night hosts replayed the exchange, pausing just before her mic drop line to savor the tension. On podcasts and talk shows, the same question echoed. When did grace become the loudest form of protest? But not everyone joined the celebration. Conservative pundits scrambled to reclaim the narrative, arguing she had been overpraised, that the moment was stage theater. Yet even their critiques sounded defensive, brittle against the resonance of her calm, because while they dissected her tone, the rest of the country had already decided tone was the victory. In communities across America, murals appeared overnight, her silhouette framed beneath the words "Integrity still matters." College students shared clips between lectures. Pastors wove her words into sermons about dignity over ego. For a rare moment, politics felt less like chaos and more like clarity. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said almost nothing. A single post appeared on her feed. "Thank you for the love. Let's turn moments into movement." No hashtags, no fanfare, just purpose. The world kept spinning, but something in the air had shifted. Her calm had become a catalyst. Across race, gender, and class, people saw themselves reflected in her restraint, not as silence, but as power held steady. And as the story kept replaying across screens, one question grew louder than the applause. If integrity can still go viral, what else might be possible when dignity leads the conversation? The headlines faded, but the echo did not. Weeks later, when the frenzy quieted and the clips stopped looping on every feed, Jasmine Crockett finally sat down for an interview. No stage lights this time, just a simple chair, a cup of coffee, and the same unshakable calm that had disarmed a courtroom. "I didn't come here to be anyone's symbol," she said gently. "I came here to serve." There was no bravado in her tone, no hint of the viral storm she had sparked. She spoke about her district, her work, the late nights reading case files while the city slept. And in that humility, the country saw what it had been longing for, a leader who didn't need a spotlight to cast light. Commentators tried to label her moment, calling it historic, feminist, iconic, but she brushed it all aside. "What matters," she said, "is whether people who never felt seen before now know they can stand tall too." The storm she endured was never about one exchange with power. It was about redefining what power looks like when worn with grace. The viral clip became more than a soundbite. It became a mirror. When power met integrity that day, only one of them still echoed. In quiet corners of America, her words found new homes, in classrooms, in sermons, in kitchen table conversations about dignity. People began to believe again that restraint could roar louder than rage. And as that belief settled, so did a truth that felt almost revolutionary. Maybe leadership isn't about volume, but presence. Maybe history doesn't always turn on shouting matches, but on moments of stillness that remind us who we are. The gavel had fallen long ago, yet the resonance remained, an echo not of confrontation, but of clarity. Integrity still mattered, and now the country remembered why. His words echoed across the courtroom, but it was her response that carried across the nation. What began as a moment of tension became a masterclass in grace, proof that dignity, when held steady, can outlast any show of power. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout, didn't flinch, didn't fight to be heard. She simply spoke truth, and the world leaned in. In times like these, when truth feels fragile and outrage feels endless, dignity itself becomes an act of rebellion. It reminds us that restraint is not weakness, and calm is not surrender. It's control. Her composure wasn't silence. It was strength shaped by purpose. So now, the echo is ours to carry. Comment what this moment meant to you. Share this video if you believe grace is the new power. Subscribe for more stories that prove integrity still wins, because it does, every time we choose it over ego. The world will keep testing the truth, but voices like hers and hearts like yours keep it alive. Remember, one moment of calm can shake an empire of noise. Be the echo.